Welcome everyone to the launch of this report, Zero Carbon Options. I'm very pleased that you can all make it, and I especially welcome my peer reviewers, my co-authors and collaborators and supporters of this effort. Particularly over 100 people who went into their own pocket to make this happen and to make hard copies of this happen. I appreciate that support very, very much. I want to start with some good news because there is some good news, and the good news is that a fully decarbonised, energy-rich world is in reach. There is no technological obstacle to that outcome, and that would mean power, water, food and development for a world of 10 billion people, plus the means to protect and maintain and restore a bio-rich planet. This is good news. We should never lose sight of this possibility. However, we have some very serious policy problems that we're going to need to kick over in order to realise that. To give you some idea of the policy problem, I just would like to show you this graph and point out that Australia forms climate change strategy based on the message that you can take away from this graph. Now, this graph shows the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation in Australia 1 year to the next. This gives the impression that if you start reducing these emissions and those bars start going in the other direction, that we're getting somewhere and that we're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, that bears no relationship at all to the way climate change actually works. The way climate change works is much better represented by this chart. Greenhouse gas accumulates. It's long-lived. It's not like particulate pollution where if you turn off the source, it washes out of the air quite quickly and goes away and things get better. When the greenhouse gas accumulates, the temperature forcing builds. So what you see in this chart are those same numbers added one on top of the other year to year. That's a better representation of the environmental impact of the greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity sector. That's what's happening. And what we have and we're seeing now, unfortunately, is tipping points appear to be very, very real for us, not even in the latter part of this century, but in this century. Overlaid on that, we have a global carbon budget. Now, where it is, we're not quite sure. Maybe it's there, maybe it's down here and we've already blown it. But the fact is it's a zero-sum game, and the job is to stay within the carbon budget. That means that the pathway to where we're going matters as much as the destination. So here are two charts, two pathways to potential decarbonisation. And you can see they both end in 2050 and they both end somewhere different. The one on the left ends higher with more emissions in the year 2050 than the graph on the right. But that's not just the point. The other point is that section there, which is the avoided emissions along the way. So decarbonising quickly is as important as decarbonising totally. Now, these graphs come from the tool which has recently been released by CSIRO called eFutures. There's one difference in the criteria between these charts, and it's that box there. Nuclear permitted, select yes or no. And it generates those two different outcomes. And that's because nuclear mimics fossil fuel but without the greenhouse gas. It does the same job. But nuclear power is at present prohibited, legally prohibited by 2 acts in Australia. So selecting no, either in this tool or in national policy, is guaranteed to deliver an economically and environmentally inferior result. And I wonder what it would look like if we did a single comparative case study of this. And that brings me to this report, Zero Carbon Options. That's exactly what we've done. A single case study examining 2 zero carbon energy options for a single task. The task that was set was in fact defined by the report that preceded us, called Repower Port Augusta, where they set themselves the job of replacing the Northern and Playford power stations. These stations have a generating capacity of 740 megawatts. They've been responsible for up to and over 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas every year. They're a significant contributor to South Australia's greenhouse gas. And the electricity generation target is 4,650 gigawatt hours per year. Now, we've clarified that we think replacing those power stations mean not just that quantity of electricity, but delivered reliably when we need it, dispatchably, which is what the coal-fired generation does. So we've compared 2 options. A reference renewable option, which is a solar and wind generation hybrid. This comes from the source report, Repower Port Augusta. This is not our suggested pathway for renewable. This is the option that has been put forward by others. It combines concentrating solar thermal power towers with heliostat mirror fields and some energy storage in molten salt. 6 of those modules for 760 megawatts to give 2,810 of those gigawatt hours that are needed. And it pairs that with 95 7.5 megawatt wind turbines to make up the balance of the electricity generation. Those 7.5 megawatt wind turbines are the very largest turbine in the world, a very new turbine and the very largest. Option 2, the reference nuclear solution, we've selected one enhanced CANDU 6 EC6 pressurised heavy water reactor. The generation rating for that plant is 690 megawatts. The image you can see there is 2 of those units side by side, recently constructed in China. I think they were commissioned in 2005. You can see them there side by side. Our replacement task only requires 1 of those. And we wanted to broaden the discussion a little bit, so we opened it up to 13 criteria across financial and economic, as well as environmental and social criteria, which you can see before you. So what I'm going to do is run you through the findings of each of those criteria, give you some indication of some of the key assumptions behind those findings, and then we'll have a lot of opportunity during the panel for those to be interrogated further. Firstly, capital cost. Reasonably important. However, the reference source document for the renewable solution didn't provide it, which makes things difficult. Obviously, if we wanted to do a comparison, we would have preferred to have drawn directly from the report, but it wasn't given. I'm not quite sure why that is. You might be able to make your own inferences. They did make one comment in there that they were seeking $5 billion in public funding in order to make up a 25% balance of financing, from which we were able to infer a capital cost for the solar component. No capital cost was provided for the wind component at all. We went with a low range estimate, not bottom, but low, of $2,000 per kilowatt hour installed in South Australia to generate that wind cost. For nuclear, we were able to draw on 3 sources of potential costs. They were highly inclusive costs. Not a lot is being left out at that capital point here. And we generated a range for $5,000 to $7,000 per kilowatt of generation installed. So what we got was $6.7 billion for the solar component, $1.4 for the wind, for a total of $8.1 billion for the hybrid renewable solution, and a range of $3.5 billion to $4.8 billion in capital for the reference nuclear solution. So that was our starting point for capital cost. Probably more important, more interesting than capital cost is the levelised cost of electricity. A little bit of jargon, of which there'll be a little bit tonight, but it's all important jargon. Levelised cost of electricity refers to the price at which the generator needs to sell the electricity as it leaves the plant in order to make their return. And the lower that price is, obviously the lower it can be at the consumer end. And this graph tells the story quite well. Wind and nuclear both sit in and around at the same range with the high and low estimates of that levelised cost of electricity, with wind being the cheaper of the two and nuclear being the slightly more expensive of the two. The solar, concentrating solar thermal, as is well known about this technology, is at this point well off the pace in terms of the price of the electricity being sold, $250 to $300 per megawatt hour versus $90 to $110 for the wind, or $101 to $138 for the nuclear. In the case of both the solar and the nuclear being quite high capital options, the cost of finance has some bearing. So that price of electricity is sensitive to the cost of the finance. If lower cost finance is available, those pricing numbers improve quite a lot. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions abatement now, which is of course the reason why we're looking at this in the first place, in principle, the replacement of those 2 power plants would result in the abatement of 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas. In an update to the Repower Port Augusta report, they nuanced that by saying between 2 and 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas. There's an important reason for that. Because the dispatchability of those plants isn't the same as coal, and the electricity needs to be sold when it is generated, there's no assurance that when it's being generated, what it will be displacing is the coal. It's possible that it would be displacing lower greenhouse forms of electricity, such as combined cycle gas, which we have at Pelican Point in South Australia, which is relatively clean. So they gave a range of 2 to 5 million tonnes of abatement. The nuclear, we can be far more confident because it actually would, like for like, replace the function as well as the production of the coal-fired power plant. And if we were running it at 85% capacity, we actually exceed that generation target by quite a little bit. That would mean we could potentially export a little more electricity to Victoria, where they use very dirty electricity, and we actually achieve more abatement. So we can achieve 5.36 million tonnes versus the 5 if we run the nuclear at 85% of its capacity, and we can do even better than that if run at 90, for which it is rated. But we went with the assumption of 85%. In terms of the lifespan, when you're kicking around $4 to $8 billion, this is probably a fairly important criteria. In terms of concentrated solar thermal, it's actually difficult to say because we don't have a great deal of experience globally with this technology yet at all. And there will probably be some difference between the lifetime performance of the mirrors and the towers and the collection and the storage technology. That may well differ from the performance of the generators, for example, which would not necessarily be that different to a generator attached to any other form of thermal plant. So we were limited in what we knew there. With wind, we've got significant global experience now with wind, and we can be quite confident in the rating there. Similarly with nuclear, we also had the benefit of specific rated lifespan for the reference solution, which was handy. So we assumed a 25-year life for the solar thermal, 25 years for the wind with good confidence. That's about what wind delivers. The nuclear reference solution is rated for a life of 60 years. Moving on now to the operational waste. This is where we see a clear distinction between the two. In terms of the hybrid renewable reference scenario, there is essentially zero operational waste. Not completely zero, it's a power plant, but for the purposes of our analysis, it's essentially a zero waste form of energy production. For the reference nuclear solution, this is the type of nuclear power station that does generate spent nuclear fuel, which is classified as high-level nuclear waste. A single EC6 running for 1 year generates 104 tonnes of spent fuel, and that would be stored on site in a storage system called MACSTOR. Now, there's nothing better than pictures to tell the story from here. So this is how that works. Fuel bundles are removed from the reactor when spent and assembled into these structures. They are then loaded as cylinders into these welded steel baskets. The welded steel baskets are then loaded into these concrete monoliths that sit on site as the MACSTOR facility. So that's diagrammatic, but fortunately we have an image of it. So you can get a grasp of the scale there. You can see that sort of capital I shape on the profile. So that's a MACSTOR storage facility in use. I guess when people worry about people stealing spent nuclear fuel, I'm not quite sure they grasp that it's as dangerous to a terrorist as it is to anyone else. So picking it up and running away with it's kind of difficult. And unless you have the Incredible Hulk on payroll, I'm not sure how you're getting into one of those devices. That's how it's stored on site. So in the lifetime of the EC6, the 60 years, it would produce 6,250 tonnes of that spent fuel in MACSTOR storage. That requires an area of 9,500 square metres, which is approximately a soccer field. So to put that in perspective, if you think of the playing surface at Hindmarsh Stadium, that's the size of area required for the lifetime storage of the spent fuel. Now, what many of us know, and hopefully soon all of us will know, is that well within the lifetime of this reactor, that fuel can be recycled so that a further 99% of it is used to generate zero carbon electricity in a Generation 4 fast reactor called here a PRISM. General Electric at the present is petitioning the UK government actively to let them build one of these reactors to help the UK government dispose of an unwanted stockpile of separated plutonium. They are so confident in this that they did go ahead with the feasibility study, which has shown no obstacle to licensing. And they even said to the UK government, don't pay us to build this, we will build it and then we'll charge you per unit of plutonium that we get rid of and per unit of zero carbon electricity that we generate at the same time. So they have a very, very high level of confidence in building this technology, and they want to do it now. So I think any presumption that we would be stuck with that spent nuclear fuel indefinitely is simply not correct. In terms of land use, as I showed you before, we have these 2 units of EC6, or in fact it's CANDU 6, the enhanced CANDU is the evolution, but 2 units of CANDU 6 at 1360 megawatts here, shown in China. That is the currently largest solar power station in the world in the United States, known as SEGS, rated for 350 megawatts. So you can see we're getting 1,360 megawatts on essentially a spit of land in China, and you can see the landscape scale of attempting to make baseload power using the sun. There is plenty of sunlight, but it's very dilute or dispersed, and the challenge is actually capturing enough of it and storing it and concentrating it, and that takes up a lot of space. The exact numbers provided are that the renewable solar option would require 16 square kilometres of exclusive land. So if you've run the city to bay, then you've run 3/4 of the perimeter, would be one way of thinking about it. The renewable technology, you can think in terms of the exclusive and non-exclusive use. In terms of exclusive use being the footprint of the actual turbines, the service roads and the buildings, it's about 2.1 square kilometres. In terms of the entire project area that encloses all of the individual turbines, it's a very large area, about 175 square kilometres. The nuclear, we have selected 2 square kilometres based on taking the area of that plant shown and about 70% of that area, because we only need 1 of the units. So quite a big difference there in that criteria. Water consumption is something that people are often curiously sceptical of, I guess, in terms of nuclear power. A wind turbine essentially is a zero water energy producer. The blade is being spun and energy is being generated from the turbine. The solar thermal and power towers will require clean water for washing the mirrors every year, but they have stated in the reference case that they would be air cooled. The present setup in Port Augusta is ocean water cooling for the thermal power stations, and that is exactly what is happening here. So there is essentially, under the nuclear reference scenario, no change in the current water arrangement, which isn't drawing on any freshwater supplies. So I guess we need to distinguish between water consumption and perhaps potable or potentially potable water consumption is more the point. So the renewable solution does require 0.74 gigalitres of fresh water annually. The other 2 types of energy generation are not competing with potable water. Material inputs. Again, we use this criteria mainly in order to perhaps address a common criticism of nuclear power, not necessarily because we feel that this criteria should make or break the energy decision, but we do think there's some interesting information here. But again, the quality of the information was a little varied. In terms of the concentrating solar thermal, the reference report for the renewable solution gave us information for the heliostats only and not the towers. So I guess fair confidence there, but it's certain to be an underestimate. In terms of wind, there is good general literature. However, we didn't have anything specific to the Enercon turbines, so I guess we'd call that good. With the nuclear option, we had very detailed and extensive estimates for the CANDU 6 from that construction project in China. So we have excellent confidence there, and you can see that in the graph with the quarter by quarter consumption, in this case of concrete, and the red line going up is the overall consumption to the end, and the box in the middle gives us quite good details about just what they had included in that estimate. So it was very good to have such good data there. To really understand it though, we actually need to combine a few criteria. So in terms of the material inputs, just at the baseline, the nuclear does come out with something of an advantage here. Slightly more concrete than the overall renewable solution, but far less steel and essentially no glass of the 3 materials that we considered. But if we go back to both the lifespan and the annual output, we know that we're getting longer life and higher output out of the nuclear plant, in both cases by quite a lot. So the bottom line is that under those assumptions, we actually end up with 3 times the lifetime output, or nearly 3 times, of zero carbon electricity for that input of materials. So to consider that criteria in a way that is appropriately context, we need to take that into account. Capacity factors, this is our next bit of jargon, but again, important jargon. The capacity factor is a ratio. It's a ratio of what a generator could produce according to its rating if it were running non-stop all year versus what it does produce. So in a nutshell, it's one divided by the other. Example there of a wind turbine, if it was capable of producing 65,700 but it instead did produce 21,900, the capacity factor given would be 33%. That's about typical of a wind turbine. Now that speaks to the overall variability in the intermittency. It doesn't mean that it only runs 33% of the time. That's not the way capacity factor should be interpreted. Again, fortunately we had very clear information here. 30% assumed for the renewable, 40% for the solar thermal. The nuclear EC6 is rated to about 90%, but for our analysis we assumed 85%, which is basically starting to give you the clue that the nuclear is a highly reliable way of delivering electricity. Which brings us again to reliability, which is in words probably the longest section of the report in terms of the criteria analysis. So we've gone into quite a bit of detail in the report. I'm going to try to sum it up in the simplest possible way I can here with a slide, which is this. Solar plus wind doesn't equal coal. So it is not the case that you can simply merge or hybridise 2 intermittent, climate-dependent generating solutions and provide the same service as a coal-fired power station. You may provide the same quantity of electricity. There is no assurance of providing the same service. Nuclear, for all intents and purposes, equals coal minus greenhouse gas. Here we are providing both the quantity of electricity and the service in terms of fully dispatchable, always available electricity that is highly reliable. Bottom line being that under the renewable reference scenario, South Australia's electricity supply would have diminished reliability, and under the nuclear scenario, it would be undiminished reliability. In terms of job creation, again, for us, this is not a make or break criteria for how the decision ought to be made, and it would appear from the information that was available that both options provide a good job creation outcome. That should be expected when such sums of money are being spent. That's not any particular surprise, but certainly the nuclear does provide a very healthy job creation outcome, and certainly the ongoing jobs are some pretty enticing ones. Network enhancement refers to any challenges of actually getting these solutions connected. And there's a little bit of interesting story to tell here. In terms of the renewable solution at the local level, i.e. where we would want to plug it in, there is no specific barrier identified. In that region, the infrastructure that is there would probably cope with what's being provided to it. And we undertook some consultation with Electronet, and they were able to confirm that. On the broader picture though, the sheer size of this in terms of new intermittent capacity being added to South Australia would suggest that we would need to be moving towards this green grid situation of network interconnection with the other states in order to actually share this electricity in an economically efficient way. Already with the high penetration that we have of wind in South Australia, there are negative price events occurring. That's another way of saying overnight so much electricity is being produced from the wind that it's exceeding demand. The price of electricity drops below zero and electricity is essentially being dumped. That's a consequence of progressing to higher and higher levels of penetration of a generation source that is intermittent in the way that wind is. So you can see in that image on the right, that's taken from Worley Parsons' Green Grid report for the South Australian Government, identifying potential interconnection. So with such a large addition of intermittent capacity, I think it's very probable that it would need to accompany that. The nuclear solution has a different problem, and that's the size of the single generating unit. So bear with me here, but at the moment, the South Australian grid is permitted to lose up to 260 megawatts of generation at a time. In a single contingency event, that's how much it can lose. That's how much it's regulated to lose. It's modelled at the moment to be able to lose up to about 650. It's not modelled to lose beyond that. which is another way of saying that because the EC6 is 680, it's too big to plug in at the moment. The coal that it's replacing, Northern Playfair, is actually split up into 3 separate generating units, the largest being 260. So that's that regulated limit. So there are ways around that, which is either the enhanced interconnection, new large sources of demand in South Australia, or perhaps investigating what I've shown here in an image, which is small modular reactor technology. So where the single generating unit is at 180 megawatts. That would be no problem, and you could run a few of them in a series to get that outcome. So there would be potentially ways around that. Interesting message, though, I guess, out of that is that an enhanced network is good for all comers. Everyone benefits from a better, more interconnected network. Finally, the existing global and local capacity. We wanted to get a feeling for how challenging it might be overall to get these technologies going on the basis of how commercially mature they are. So if we were to deploy the nuclear solution in Australia, this would be nationally significant because we have not done nuclear power yet in Australia. Globally, however, that would be entirely manageable. It wouldn't be far off trend currently with growth of nuclear, and technologically it would be completely unremarkable. This is very mature technology. For solar, this isn't the case. If this reference solution went ahead, we would be creating by far the largest single facility in the world for solar. It would be 76 times bigger than currently the largest Australian solar. And so I guess we have added a note of caution that perhaps the solar industry should be consulted a little more carefully about whether this is actually the best stepping up of solar for Australia. And some friends I have in the industry have suggested they might be a lot more interested in perhaps a few medium-sized projects before going after something quite this big. In terms of wind, it would be a 58% increase in the wind capacity of South Australia, and that would be difficult. Again, just to put that in some context, there's the world's largest solar, that's 350 megawatts. There are 65 gigawatts of nuclear under construction in the world at the moment, and 175 gigawatts of it either on order or planned. Not proposed, on order or planned. Proposed is quite a bit more. To conclude, we do have options. There is not only one way to decarbonise. And this option could mean 10% more greenhouse gas abatement per year for about half the capital cost, providing a significantly cheaper source of electricity that is completely reliable, consuming far less land and no fresh water, requiring less material resources to build with over double the lifespan, that uses our local fuel source and provides high-tech jobs deploying a commercially mature technology. So it would appear to me that there's really only one question left to ask, and that is this: is Australia ready to put this option on the table? And ultimately, that's what the nuclear advocates that I spend time speaking to are seeking. To please have the option put on the table, at which point we're very happy to see the processes play out. We're very happy to see this technology compete.